This is the Ian Stephenson collection, currently at the Watchtower in Berwick, and represents about a quarter of his total output. In his final year at King's College, Durham University in 1956-57, Ian Stephenson painted some cubist, or perhaps more accurately, cubo-futurist paintings, these three based on the figure of Diana, where he seems more interested in the spaces in the painting rather than the objects. After he graduated in 1956, Ian was appointed first tutorial student, then student demonstrator, to teach on the basic course to first-year students, devised by Richard Hamilton and Victor Passmore. The course had no strict syllabus, but was rather a method of inquiry. It concentrated on the basics of painting, line, colour, tone, and so forth, made from various experimental forms of mark making. Both Hamilton and Passmore stressed science. Passmore, the imagery coming from science, and Hamilton, the clear, rational thought of science. Ian was very good at teaching this, and particularly interpreting the rather gnomic remarks made by Passmore to puzzled students. In January 1959, Ian marries Kate Brown, who had just recently graduated from King's. And they both went on a kind of honeymoon to Italy, both having been awarded travelling scholarships.
We went to Italy. That was where he started with some very round things, because all the confetti there had perfect circles and different colours. When we got there, it was freezing. But this was January, you see. They never had on the end that they don't go out at all in that time. So we walked around a nearly empty Rome, which was much more interesting than when the crowds came later in May and June and things.
In late 1959, they come back from Italy to London, where Ian has been appointed to teach at Chelsea School of Art and Kate to work at the Courtauld Institute. Ian paints a number of paintings that are emblematic of painting itself, painting on the back of paintings and painting of palettes stuck on painting. The first one being his father's old palette, which he calls parental palette, with his love of alliteration.
His father was a working person for going around mending roofs and things. They were all, both Ian and his father were always very stood back from things. But yes, they would talk about art, and I think it saved his father's estate was that Ian did then go to art school.
In 1960, he made this scree, which was a first attempt to make a painting constructed by four similar rectangular elements and using a whole variety of painterly techniques. In this way, I connect it to the later early diorama, which has the words Via Lactea written upside down in the right-hand square, being the first direct reference to the astronomical imagery that so excited him.
Oh, he looked at everything that he could put his hands on all his life. He wasn't trying to paint that. He could see it as something that he could lift onto a piece of work. It was always lying down. He just kept dropping the paint or doing another one a bit further away. It wasn't trying to make art, in my view. He was trying to prove something he wanted to know more about.
In 1961, he made this series of 5 small paintings that he was very pleased with and gave as a present to his wife. They're called proto-palettes plastic palettes are collaged onto card, but the two areas, support and palette, are painted at different times and then brought together, giving a delicious ambiguity to the space involved. Ian made a large number of sketches pursuing his inquiry into how falling paint could form different shapes and conglomerations. In these black ones, scratching away, so they made even holes in the paper. Sometimes he put paint on the tips of darts and dropped them into the paper with some kind of board beneath, so that there's quite a large projection of the dart holes. Or matchsticks, putting paint onto the tips of matches and dropping them. And considering how the tone varied if you dropped the same match number of times. He looked at what happened when paint dropped wet into wet. He was eating a kind of enamel called japlak at the time. And here he tries out different tightnesses of dropping. He often refers to this as bombing and uses the kind of technical terms to do with the spread of bombing, the areas in which bombs might cover when aiming at a particular target, and then how this can be combined into some kind of idea of making a painting. Scraping away paint and scraping paint across, trying all different kinds of mark making to make large amounts of paint that have space in them. Here again you've got a variety of particular targets and then wet into wet, spreading by using more medium in the paint. And wonderful black ones. Here he's actually painted actual targets onto it, and there's a combination of darts, but also by tilting the paper, he can make it run down and create lines. He seems to be searching at this time to find a way to make paintings, and I think the evidence of the paintings is that he always aimed at a single method. He was looking for the clearest single method from which he could achieve the kind of results in spatial and colour and tonal combinations. In 1961-62, he makes Trace, a painting in which he again explores a painting divided into separate sections. The right-hand side is a third of the total width of the painting. And at first he has the painting on the floor, flicking paint down onto it, and then covers up that right-hand third, perhaps of the sheet of paper, and continues flicking, and eventually puts the painting up on an easel and starts putting on slugs of paint, possibly with a palette knife, so that we have a division in the painting that exists perhaps in the paint at the bottom part of the painting, but one sees it going right up through it.
Ian was trying to push art out of it, I think, in order to get the effect of all the speckles in the universe, in fact.
In 1964, he made Aspect 6, one of a series of works on paper, in which the collage rectangle in the middle of the painting is of a very different kind of uneven paper than the paper it's mounted on, and clearly painted with spray from a toothbrush, spraying paint down onto the flat surface, but separately from the ground paper, which are then collaged together and a certain amount of spray added. So there's an ambiguity between the two surfaces and between the two experiences of space, and especially out towards the sides of the painting, the dots become sparser and sparser, very much in the way that many astronomical photos of galaxies in which the outer stars spread further and further apart. In 1966, Ian was appointed to run the basic course at King's, and so Ian and Kate moved back to Newcastle. And in 66, 67, he paints this new screen painting made of 4 identically shaped vertical panels. The painting used the new technique of all-over drip paintings with no painting stabbed on afterwards, and a whole variety of different sized circular marks depending on how thick or thin the painting was and how high above the surface it was dripped down, creating a very new kind of space, especially on this large scale, where as you approach the painting, you seem to go further and further into it, and you see more and more finer detail with tinier and tinier dots, giving you a strange feeling of space, that you're almost entering an internal space. In 1966-67, Ian painted another screen painting made of 4 large, tall rectangles, but with the proportions this time so that they came together to form a square, so that the processional element of them becomes halted by the squareness, and the composition becomes more centered. In these, he's become closer to painting each rectangle identical, but still, perhaps to his eyes, not quite close enough. In the summer of 1967, when the students were on their long vacation, Ian painted a set of 12 dioramas in one of the large studios. Each square was put on the floor on blocks, and he painted walking round the square, throwing the paint a quarter left, straight ahead, a quarter right from each side, and on certain other circuits flicking the paint down from shoulder level. After each circuit, he would then make the same circuit with the same paint round the other square, attempting by his physical movements to do exactly the same thing, so that the 2 squares would be painted as close as possible the same, but only by a physical means and not by looking at the painting and adjusting it. When the paintings were finished, he would hang them so that they were identical, and then turn one of them round to 180 degrees, so that a more fluid composition resulted, coming across the 2 squares into this double square format. He controlled the drip technique and the viscosity of the paint to get different sized circles of paint on the surface of the canvas. He spoke much later of making many memories on the face of flatness. He and Kate referred to one of these, sold to the American collector Sam Lurie, as "Lovely is the Rose," which is a quote from Wordsworth's Intimations of Immortality. And this shows how Ian took a romantic art view of the imagery that he took from 20th century science. In the summer of '68, in one of the large empty studios at King's, Ian made this painting threefold, made out of a new idea of a composite painting made out of 3 parts, 2 rectangles and a square. One rectangle having the proportions of 1 to 2, the other one of 2 to 3, and the square of side 2, so that the whole becomes a series of proportions of 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. He also left instructions on the back that it could be hung in any orientation, but I think this current one is particularly satisfying. In the summer of 1969, in 2 of the large studios at King's, Ian and an assistant, Mike Brick, made Quadrama 1 and Quadrama 4, each a composite of 4 large rectangular paintings. When Ian was painting Quadrama 4 in one studio, Mike Brick painted Quadrama 1, which is the one we see here. Ian gave Mike fairly minimal instructions of how to throw the paint and mixed the colours for him, but it said he could put them on in any order he liked. I think the difference between these Quadramas and the previous 2 years' paintings were that there's far more where drips obscure previous drips, and the surface builds up and is darker and darker. Mike reported that Ian was only really interested as obliteration increased. I feel that the elegiac quality that we see in the dioramas, but treated in a lightish way, now becomes darker and more sombre in these paintings. When each panel of the Quadramas had dried, they were taken off the stretchers and then restretched on stretchers that were 20 centimetres smaller, giving a feeling that the whirling particles of paint filled a whole volume rather than just arrived on a surface, giving an even greater sense of their infinite, uncountable number. In 1970, Ian and Kate moved back to London, and Ian takes up a new post as director of the postgraduate painting course at Chelsea. This takes place away from the main building at a new place at Bagley's Lane, where Ian has a large studio, in which he makes, in 1972, a new series called the Sands End series from Beyond the World's End. This has a wonderful romantic Wordsworthian ring to it, but it also has a prosaic meaning. Bagley's Lane is in the area Sands End. It is a little further down the King's Road than the World's End, so the title is also prosaic and accurate. Nevertheless, the paintings, I think, take on the full romantic feel of Ian's view of our current situation in the universe.
Those paintings, which were a big painting and two small ones, they titled them by where they were up and down from all that long bit of Chelsea. When one looks at a catalogue, you will see that there's always a big painting and two smalls with them. And some went over the edge and some went inwards. And I still don't understand them, except that they were trying to work out what the galaxy was like.
Somewhere between the 5th century BCE and the 2nd century BCE, the book of Ecclesiastes, part of the Hebrew Bible, was written. And the first sentence in that book is, "Who can number the sand of the sea and the drops of rain and the days of eternity?" At roughly the same time, on the 3rd century BCE, Archimedes, the greatest scientist and mathematician of the ancient world, also wrote a book called The Sand Reckoner. His first sentence was, "Some think, O King Hiero, that the grains of sand cannot be counted." He then, rather playfully, proceeds to count not the number of grains of sand on a seashore, but the number of grains of sand in the entire universe. And to do so, he has to invent a new number system. The number system of the ancient world couldn't handle large numbers. So we have two important books written roughly at the same time, one of which introduces the idea of infinity, that the universe is infinite, and the other of which says it's very, very large, but finite, and can be estimated. Ian's series, Sands End series from Beyond the World's End, seems to contain both those views. This particular painting, Thames, he said, refers to the painters he loved who painted the river: Turner, Monet, Whistler, Victor Passmore. Other paintings also had strange references. For example, one is called Manresa, and this, he said, referred to the main college building in Manresa Road, but also to the town in which Ignatius Loyola wrote his book of contemplations, which were always of a visual nature. So he liked to, in lots of ways and playfully, to refer to both spiritual matters and prosaic matters. The difference between this series and the previous large paintings is that the main painting has a border that's part of it. In other words, that the idea that the painting might go on infinitely large, which seems present in quadrama, is no longer there. In some way, the uncountable number of drops of paint that create it are somehow contained. He also made at the same time 2 paintings on paper that he called understudies. He was quite clear that these were not studies for the larger painting, but related to it. The larger of the 2 understudies has a border drawn, but around, slightly outside the main body of the paint, which was obviously masked in order to do this. But the masking allowed certain drops to escape, so to speak, towards this border. The smaller of the 2 works on paper, the other understudy, is one in which there is a collage element in the middle, and which has clearly been painted away from the external part, so that there is this strange ambiguity between the way the colour works and falls onto the paper between the 2. So the 3 together form an interesting meditation on the edge and seem to raise the question, is the universe contained? Are we contained? Or is it infinite and open?